We begin this morning with the final push ahead of the 2022 midterms, with early voting now underway in many states from coast to coast.
Today, President Biden will hit the campaign trail with John Fetterman. The Pennsylvania Democrat is locked in a close race with Dr. Mehmet Oz, the celebrity TV personality who has been backed by former President Trump. Taking a look at the polls this morning, the economy and inflation are among voters' top concerns this election season. Republicans holding a slight advantage over Democrats when voters were asked which party they would prefer to handle each issue. At stake, of course, control of Congress. Right now, the Democrats hold a slight lead in the House of Representatives, while the Senate is deadlocked right down the middle, with Vice President Kamala Harris giving Democrats the slightest of edges. We've got full team coverage this morning with NBC News Washington correspondent Michelle Sindor and NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray. So, Mark, let's start with you. As I mentioned, President Biden is going to visit Pennsylvania today to stump for the lieutenant governor, John Fetterman, who's locked in a heated Senate contest with Republican challenger Dr. Oz. A new AARP poll found that the state, looking at the state, found that Fetterman and Oz are really polling within the margin of error, so a statistical tie. What kind of impact do you think President Biden's visit will have here, considering most Democrats really aren't asking for his help on the trail?
Yeah, Joe, and what President Biden is actually doing is attending a fundraiser for John Fetterman. It's not one of those kind of big rallies that we'd often see former President Donald Trump do for Republican candidates, or even former President Barack Obama for Democratic candidates. Joe Biden's kind of had a different approach where he's actually been raising money. He's been holding speeches in Washington, D.C., as we heard earlier this week, on the issue of abortion. He's been talking about the infrastructure law, as well as reducing health care costs from the White House, talking about energy prices from the White House, going to Oregon and California. But he really hasn't been holding the big kind of rallies that we'd often see in the key battleground states. And even though President Biden is going to one of the marquee contests this entire midterm cycle, it's not necessarily one of those big rallies that we're accustomed to.
And Mark, I want to move to the Midwest, where candidates in Wisconsin's gubernatorial race are now actually pulling neck and neck with their first debate set for tonight. And we're also seeing Republican Senator Ron Johnson in a tight race of his own there. So what should we be watching for in what's really a critical swing state?
I love the term that you just used, neck and neck, because that almost describes every Wisconsin race over the past decade. And of course, we ended up seeing President Biden win Wisconsin by about 10,000 votes in 2020. We saw former President Donald Trump win Wisconsin by about 10,000 votes. Every race in Wisconsin comes down to 1 or 2 percentage points. And we knew this going into the cycle, and both the gubernatorial race as well as that Senate contest between Senator Ron Johnson and Democrat Mandela Barnes is going to be incredibly tight in maybe the most polarized state over the past decade.
And Mark, let's look big picture here. Democrats are trying to buck the trend of the majority party losing power after the midterms. We're seeing some Republicans in much tighter races than maybe you would historically expect in a midterm like this. So what are you watching for now from both sides in this home stretch?
Yeah, Joe, one thing that makes this midterm cycle different than the others I've covered is just the sheer unpopularity of so many candidates, Democratic or Republican. And so you end up looking in places like Iowa, where that's now a comfortably red Republican state. But incumbent Senator Chuck Grassley is in a really close contest, according to a recent Des Moines Register poll. Similarly, you end up having a situation where the incumbent governor of in Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, Oklahoma's a really big Republican state, but he's in a close contest as well, too. And some Republicans are being just kind of dragged down by the sheer unpopularity. Voters are unhappy with everybody right now. And then, of course, I still think that the favorites to win re-election are Stitt in Oklahoma and Grassley in Iowa. But the fact that there are so many people who are unhappy and they're unpopular politicians from both sides make it a tough environment to run for re-election.
Well, 19 days away. We'll be watching closely. Mark Murray, thank you so much.
A federal judge is ordering an ex-lawyer of former President Trump to turn over dozens of new documents to the January 6th committee. Some of those documents from Trump's former attorney, John Eastman, include emails allegedly showing efforts to disrupt the confirmation of the former president's loss back in 2020. The judge ruled the documents must be handed over to the committee because they are related to an attempted crime, exempt from any sort of attorney-client privileges. The judge also said that Trump was aware that the number of voter fraud fraud cases he alleged in a lawsuit challenging Georgia's election results were inaccurate. Eastman invoked the Fifth Amendment when he testified before a grand jury back in August.
We're also taking a closer look this morning at election security ahead of the midterms, a polarizing topic of discussion in the wake of the 2020 election. And it's also the focus of the latest installment of Meet the Press Reports, airing tonight right here on NBC News Now. So let's bring in NBC News Washington correspondent Yamiche Alcindor for a preview. It's so good to see you. So what have the implications been of Florida's so-called election police force, Yamiche? Can you first explain what exactly they're doing there and the effect you're seeing it have on voters specifically?
Well, good morning, Ziegler. It's a critical question because my story for Meet the Press Reports really centers on this fact. The false claim that the 2020 election was stolen has now become a top and critical GOP talking point, part of the party's larger approach to elections post-2020. National organizations are recruiting poll workers and poll watchers to become part of the election systems across this country, so part of the people counting the ballots this November. The state Republican officials have also been using their power to pass new laws that critics say will be critical in restricting voting access, making it easier to overturn election results, and criminalizing voting in unfair ways. In Florida, in particular, which is what you asked me about, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill in April to create an election police force dedicated to pursuing voter fraud. So far, at least 20 people have been arrested by the unit. Here's a clip featuring the Florida Secretary of State, an interview that I did with him defending the state's actions. In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill in April to create an election police force dedicated to pursuing voter fraud. So far, at least 20 people have been arrested by the unit.
When you don't enforce your laws, you encourage more bad behavior.
What do you say to critics who say that the Office of Election Crimes and Security, what some have called the Election Police Force, that was created to establish a false narrative, a political narrative about a problem that doesn't really exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just completely inaccurate and belies the truth that there are people that vote that aren't entitled to vote. And every single person that votes that shouldn't undermines someone the legal vote of someone else.
Byrd said the unit is looking at the whole state, but he added that there will be more issues in bigger counties like Miami-Dade, Broward, Hillsborough, and Duval.
So it's just a coincidence right now that you're starting with mostly Democratic, heavily populated areas.
I know what you're trying to say, and that's not what I'm saying. Is that's where the volume is. I mean, Miami-Dade County has 1.5 million voters.
So when critics look at that and say you're going after Democratic-led counties, Democratic-leaning counties, your response is
absolutely false.
But advocates say those arrested did not know they were breaking the law, and that in many cases, government officials had sent them voting materials that allowed them to cast ballots. A number of lawyers for those arrested told us they are fighting the charges in court.
None of these folks should have been arrested in the first place.
So there you have it, really, the advocates saying that these are people who did not know they were breaking the law. In many cases, you had the state of Florida mailing them voting materials in this case. So people were registering to vote and then getting letters from the state, that's what attorneys told me, and then casting their ballots. And then only years and years or months later were they then arrested in those really shocking videos that were put out by the Tampa Bay Times. Ziegler.
I mean, incredibly engaging conversation and reporting also, Yamiche. I know that there are also so-called MAGA, Make America Great Again poll watchers. So can you talk to us about that? Because we've talked about the so-called election police. What are they doing in the midterm election, and what's their role as people head out to vote pretty soon?
Well, we have these outside organizations, including one headed up by Cleta Mitchell, who was a former lawyer for former President Trump, who was trying to overturn the 2020 election. She is now, with a number of other people, trying to organize poll watchers, and they're essentially trying to get people to be the ones that are counting the ballots, conservatives who are counting the ballots. There are some election officials who tell me they're worried about nefarious actors infiltrating their systems. Of course, some Republicans told me that they just want to see how all of this works. They want to take this into account. They don't want to meddle with things. They just want to see how things work. But of course, the real worry here is that things will get too far, that people will get heated, and that Republicans will not want to see Democratic ballots cast. They'll challenge those. And there is some worry that maybe Democratic poll watchers might do the same for Republicans, even though I have to tell you, it's on the Republican side that we're seeing the election deniers and most of the lies about the election.
Yeah, and Yamiche, briefly here, the thread has been election fraud. So how widespread is the belief of election fraud among not candidates, not voters, but candidates specifically who are running for office this year?
What you're seeing in the Republican Party right now are 2022 candidates leaning in on the election lies of 2020, leaning in on the language of former President Trump, who is continuing to say that the 2020 election was stolen, even though it was free and fair. And there are a number of Republicans, including former Attorney General Bill Barr, who said they looked into these claims and that they were false. But I found a number of candidates, including Carrie Lake in Arizona, who's running for governor, and a number of other candidates who are on the campaign trail, standing alongside former President Trump and making these false claims. And I have to tell you, it's impacting voters and a lot of people wanting to go and stand by. Drop boxes. One voter told me that he was going to go and take his sidearm, that means a weapon, a gun, to drop boxes to watch them. So it's a little scary and dangerous out there for poll workers and poll watchers.
High-stake times. High-stake times. Yamiche Alcindor in Washington, thank you so much. And a programming reminder to everyone, you can watch Meet the Press Report Securing the Vote tonight at 10:30 p.m. Eastern here on NBC News Now. You can also watch it on demand the next day on Peacock.
President Biden says the U.S. will once again tap into the country's oil reserves in an effort to help lower fuel prices. The move comes as gas prices have spiked back up in recent weeks. AAA says the national average is now $3.83, which is actually down from last week, but it's still up about 16 cents from last month after more than 3 months of declining. For more on this, let's bring in NBC News White House reporter Lauren Egan. Lauren, good morning to you. So OPEC announced earlier this month that it would actually cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. President Biden criticized that decision, calling it short-sighted. So talk to us about the president's decision to dip into the oil reserve again. What's the strategy here?
That's right. The president, in a speech at the White House yesterday, announced that he was going to be authorizing the sale of an additional 15 million barrels of oil from the reserve. Now, the reserve are these big caverns that sit along the coast in Texas and Louisiana. And when they're full, they can hold about 620 million barrels of oil. Today, we're down to about 400 million barrels. So in that speech yesterday, the president also made another announcement. He said that his administration was going to start taking steps to refill that reserve. That's important for two reasons. One, obviously, national security issue. If we were to have some sort of major crisis, you'd want to make sure that those reserves were as full as possible. But it also sends an important message to the oil industry. Essentially, President Biden was saying to the domestic oil producers, start pumping more oil. There is going to be someone there to purchase it, meaning the U.S. government is going to be in the future buying back millions of these barrels of oil to refill that reserve. Take a listen to what the president had to say about this topic at the White House yesterday.
We're producing 12 million barrels of oil per day. And by the end of this year, we will be producing 1 million barrels a day, more than the day in which I took office. Today, the United States is the largest producer of oil and petroleum products in the world. We export more than we import.
So as you can see there, a big part of the president's strategy is continuing to put some pressure on oil companies to try and ramp up production here in the U.S., Joe.
And Lauren, I mean, we also heard President Biden call on Congress to improve energy production. What exactly does that mean? What's he looking to accomplish here?
That's right. The president in that speech yesterday said, look, I want there to be more oil production in the U.S. now to help address this issue of high energy costs. That doesn't mean that I'm abandoning my push for more green energy. The president has said we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And he's framed it a little bit as a national security issue. The White House has essentially said, look, we wouldn't be in this situation right now if we had more green energy in the U.S. right now. The president also addressed this topic in that same speech yesterday. Let's take another listen to what he had to say.
The process of getting clean energy projects approved is too cumbersome and too time-consuming. So I'm asking the Congress pass a permitting bill to speed up the approval of all kinds of energy production, from wind to solar to clean hydrogen. If we do this, it would take historic clean energy investments that I signed into law and put them into action.
Right after that speech yesterday, the president held another event in which he announced $2.8 billion in investments for 12 different states to help boost production of batteries that are used in electric vehicles. So as you can see, a big theme here is energy independence, Joe.
And very quickly, Lauren, if we don't see much of a dip in gas prices, does the president have any other tools at his disposal?
He said that he would consider tapping into the reserve again. He's definitely going to continue pressuring oil companies publicly. But to a certain extent, the oil markets are a global market, and there's always going to be some volatility inherent in them.
All right, Lauren Egan, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And turning to Ukraine this morning, the pro-Russian administration in Kherson has begun to evacuate civilians ahead of a widely anticipated offensive by Ukrainian forces.
That's as nationwide curbs on electricity usage come into effect today following a series of Russian strikes on energy facilities. Authorities are warning people to prepare for rolling blackouts. NBC News correspondent Cal Perry has the latest from Kyiv.
Fresh strikes overnight. Once again, the target, the energy infrastructure of this country, though sometimes the missiles miss and they hit residential targets, as was the case earlier this week here in Kyiv. And so the mayor is pleading with residents, turn off your electricity, save your power. This as the weather has changed here, the temperature dropping drastically overnight. And so we see this long-term goal by Russia to not just hit the energy infrastructure targets, but to strike at the civilians who live in this country. It has long been their goal to try to break the back of the civilian population, not just here in the capital, but across the country. Strikes overnight in the southern city of Mykolaiv and overnight in the northern part of the country as well. Officials here are asking for help from around the world for an air defense system and improvement to the existing air defense systems. Israel is the latest country to offer a helping hand, saying they'll provide that early alert system, holding off on the ammunition needed to fire and actually shoot those drones down. Officials here hoping very much the United States will supply that. Cal Perry, NBC News, Kyiv.
Now back to the U.S. for a check at your Morning News Now weather.
Meteorologist Michelle Grossman is with us with the forecast. Hey, Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Great to see you. And it's still cold. We're on our third day of really cold weather, but things are improving.
Yay.
This is the last morning of bitterly cold weather. We're going to start to see our rebound. But still 76 million Americans waking up to freezing temperatures. Where you see this hole here doesn't mean they're not waking up to freezing temperatures. It means their growing season is over. So everywhere else, we're looking at freeze warnings, frost advisories. Where you see this hot pink color, that's from the Ohio Valley down to the southeast, the Gulf Coast states, into portions of the Carolinas, New England, and Northeast. We are looking at freeze warnings this morning. So many of us waking up again to freeze alerts. This is a setup once again. It's sort of a repeat performance of yesterday, the day before. We had that jet stream so far to the south. It's staying cool today, but things will be changing as we go throughout the next couple of days. Back to the west, we're starting to warm. To the extreme west, we've been really warm, way above record highs the past few days. But we're starting to warm in the middle of the country here. So Dallas, 83 degrees. That's 6 degrees above normal for this time of year. They were chilly yesterday. They were chilly the day before. So this is just a preview of what's going to move to the east. But we're still chilly in Buffalo today, 46 degrees. That's 12 degrees below what is typical for this time of year. Chattanooga also in the 60s, 68 degrees in Mobile, and Jacksonville, Florida, you're only in the 60s today. So there's that jet stream to the north lifted so high that's bringing in that warm southerly flow, and that's why we're seeing temperatures into the 70s, into the 80s. Dallas today, 88 degrees, big improvement over yesterday. That's about 12 degrees above normal for this time of year. San Antonio, 86 degrees. And we're seeing mild as we go throughout early next week. Temperatures in the 70s in Cincinnati, into the 80s over the weekend in portions of the south. So we're improving. Pattern change. We're going to kind of flip-flop. We have that jet stream dip to the south today in the east. But look what happens as we go throughout early next week. It shifts. So we're going to bring in that cooler air into the northwest. There's that big flip, 10 to 25 degrees, temperature plunge in the west. And then on the flip side, in the east of the Rockies, we are looking at 10 to 20 degrees above average. It's all due to this area of low pressure finally moving off, but still bringing the chance for some rounds of showers, some wet snowflakes in the Great Lakes. But that's going to move further away, and that's going to improve conditions. So the chill easing in the east. It's warm in the Central Plains, sunny and warm in the southwest. Temperatures near 90 degrees today in Los Angeles. And we do have a fire risk in the Intermountain West to critical levels. And that's because we have low humidity. We have some gusty winds in place, and it's really dry, too. So 9 million impacted. Where you see the red, that's your red flag warning. That's portions of the Intermountain West, also portions of the Ohio Valley, too. So what that means is you just have to be careful. Everything's really dry, so if you light a match or you ignite something, it could spread very, very fast.
Important to be careful.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.